Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for August 6, 2021. I'm going to begin with a analysis from a new report from Wall Street on Parade about the decision made last week by Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell to establish a new standing repo facility. Now, repo refers to repurchasing agreement. And what this means is that when there's a liquidity crunch, as there was in September 2019, that the Fed steps in and opens a window whereby companies that need cash can take some financial instrument or security and essentially trade it as collateral overnight for cash and then repay the next day with a little bit of interest. Now, what this represents is an example of a collapsing system. You have corporations that are not making enough profit to pay even the interest on their outstanding loans. And so they have a need for overnight liquidity. Interbank lending freezes under these circumstances, as the banks don't want to risk making money available to corporations that may not be able to repay it. So the Fed stepped in, and in September 2019, initially they stepped in with a $20 billion overnight loan capability. It went up to $40 billion, $50 billion, eventually hundreds of billions of dollars overnight to avoid defaults. And these defaults would have rippled through the whole system. Now, all of a sudden, Powell has concluded that this must be done again today. The authorization for this new standing repo facility is for $500 billion, but it can go up if needed. And it essentially allows loans to primary banks, to hedge funds, to money market funds, to equity funds. And also a second facility is going to be set up that will make money available for foreign and international institutions. So we're going to have another run-up of liquidity, another speculative push to protect firms that should be going into bankruptcy reorganization, which will accelerate the trend of inflation. And this is why it's urgent that we learn the lesson from the last 50 years. It was on August 15th, 1971, that the Bretton Woods System was ended, creating a floating exchange rate system, and these repo facilities are the result of a Ponzi scheme operation that has grown out of the break with the fixed exchange rate system. On August 14th, that's a week from tomorrow, the Schiller Institute will sponsor a conference. So, are you finally willing to learn economics? And it will be about Lyndon LaRouche's prophetic warnings in the late 60s that this was coming, and then his continued forecasting after August 15th as to what the effect would be of this break with the post-war Bretton Woods system. And it's the reason LaRouche was able to forecast every bubble, and including, most importantly, September 2008. What Powell is doing now with this new standing repo facility is trying to cover for the effects of not doing what should have been done after the September 2008 crash. So sign up at theschillerinstitute.com to participate in this conference on August 14th. I'm going to take up two questions today. One is from a viewer who asked, how do you explain the apparent schizophrenia of the Biden administration? One day engaging in dialogue, but at the same time making new threats based on the usual contentless or unprovable allegations of malign intent by especially Russia and China. Well, there's an obvious answer. There's no coherent policy except the application of geopolitical ideas. The idea of geopolitics is that you always have to have an enemy image. And the enemy image is based on the threat to the existing imperial system that other nations will work together outside of the existing system. Now, the existing system today is collapsing. It's been collapsing since before 2008. And the policy of the City of London, which is at the center of the global financial system, is to make sure that there's no possible alliance of nations which could create a new financial system, which could go outside of the existing order. And so the fact that the Russians and the Chinese are strong enough that they don't have to submit to this existing rules-based order is why there are threats made against them. And you should realize, of course, that the British have a capability to run any number of false flag operations, as they did with the charges of Syrian chemical weapons use to undermine the Trump-Xi Jinping meeting that took place in 2000, I believe it was in 2017, and also the operations they ran against Russia before the Trump-Putin Helsinki summit. The idea is that if you can create a context for confrontation, then the ability to have reasonable dialogue to resolve problems goes out the window. So whenever there's a move toward collaboration, for example, today, the possibility that the reconstruction of Afghanistan, which is essential if you're going to end the war, the terrorism, the opium poppy production, and so on in that country, the potential for the neighbors of Afghanistan to work together, we're now seeing a new false flag, the blaming of Iran for a drone attack on a tanker that's licensed to an Israeli owner. Now, has any evidence been presented to show that Iran did it? No, none whatsoever. The evidence is the UK, that is the British, and the Israelis, who essentially are British assets, came forward and immediately blamed Iran. And then the United States jumped in and said, yes, it was Iran. Well, Iran is one of the nations that's involved in the negotiations with various international groups like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Belt and Road Initiative, to come up with an economic solution to the crisis in Afghanistan. A solution to that crisis goes against British geopolitics, which has used Afghanistan as a launching pad for wars since the middle of the 19th century. So they have the capability to do it. Now, the other part of this, of course, is the growing recognition among some realists, including in the military, that Russia and China are not going to submit to the so-called rules-based order, to the Great Reset, to the Green New Deal. And so the idea of pushing Russia and China right now could cause a horrible price. For example, in the April-May Ukraine crisis, where there was an attempt to push the Russians into a very defensive posture, the Russians did a snap mobilization, which scared the hell out of the NATO forces, the NATO administrators, and forced a pullback from that confrontation. Similarly, today there's a mobilization for an Asian NATO South China Sea confrontation, possibly in the Strait of Taiwan. But the Army and the Navy have been very vocal in leaking reports of what happened when they ran their most recent war games against China and got crushed. So there's between the development of new weapons in Russia, China's logistical advantages in that part of the world, it's clear that these two countries are not going to submit to a new containment and an effort to meddle in their systems. And so at the same time you have the British pushing for that, you have a recognition by others that we'd better hold off. Now, the problem is geopolitics. And again, this is something that we have been uniquely focused on. And I think it's important to realize that what seems to be schizophrenia is actually based on a response to both the danger and also the incompetence of a geopolitical approach that the United States is taking as long as it's allied with the United Kingdom in a special relationship. Now, a second question came up, which I think is a very pertinent one, which really is, you can see from both the question of the financial situation and the strategic situation, that we are on the verge of tragedy. That is, if there's not if the globalists are not stopped, if they go ahead with the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, if they go ahead with geopolitical confrontations with Russia and China, the ultimate outcome will be tragedy for mankind. Now, some people look at tragedy as a personal thing. That is, that someone had personal failings, a leader didn't do what had to be done because of personal problems or personal weaknesses. And while there's always an element of that, classical tragedy takes a different standpoint from it for its approach, which is that it's the axioms of the society which are responsible for the tragic events. Now, this is clear in the writings of Shakespeare and Cervantes' great Don Quixote, in the works of Schiller, where you see characters like Hamlet or Sancho Panza or the Marquis of Posa in Don Carlos, who clearly have weaknesses, but their weaknesses reflect the weaknesses of the society as a whole, the axiomatics that dominate the way people respond under conditions of crisis. That's the element of tragedy which we have to focus on when we look at these things. You know, where you had 7 million tragedies after 2008 as foreclosures went on to 7 million families, many of whom were homeless or forced to move in with relatives or live in cars for months or even years afterwards. Those are personal tragedies. Those are real. But the cause of those tragedies were not that the person stupidly tried to buy a house that was too expensive when they were manipulated by the banker to think they could afford it. The tragedy is that the society is so dependent on speculative finance and the buildup of new bubbles that individuals who are just trying to improve their lives are caught up in it. And instead of having an understanding that the reason you can buy a $300,000 house on minimum wage is because there's a swindle in the loan that's being made to you, people, instead of seeing that, just say, well, this is my dream. I want to take advantage of my dream. Is that a tragedy? Yes, but the tragedy is for the whole society because we've lost the morality that's part of the American system. That happiness is not momentary possession of an object or a momentary stimulus to one's appetite. But happiness comes from a productive life building a future for all of mankind. And so when you can take that away and convince people that entertainment, or whether it's sexual or horror movies or Harry Potter, that entertainment is in this momentary stimulation, as opposed to the real quest for an immortal aspect, being able to touch immortality with your existence, that's where the tragedy is. And it's a society which benefits those who are the most greedy, those who are the most out of touch with real physical processes, that you see many others get pulled into the corruption who are not personally corrupt. So this is what we can learn from classical tragedy. Address the broad picture that creates the millions of other tragedies. And the tragedy today is that because of the mass media, because of the corruption of our political system, people don't see that. And so they grab onto something smaller that they think is feasible, that they can do, as opposed to addressing the societal crisis. So I would urge people to immerse yourself in these great tragic writings. The Don Quixote is a delightful story where you see not just the craziness of Don Quixote, but how it affects everyone around him in a collapsing feudal system, which is what Cervantes was really attacking, not some senile old man. So with that, let me come to an end. Be sure to go to theschillerinstitute.com to sign up for our conference on the 14th of August so we can avoid another immense societal tragedy if we do not correct the errors of this post-1971 system. See you soon.